Arthur Bennett stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his towering office on the 55th floor, gazing down at the glowing architectural model of the Horizon project. The intricate display of glass skyscrapers, elevated hanging gardens, and a sprawling public plaza was destined to be the most ambitious development in the history of downtown Chicago. Yet right in the center of that perfect miniature metropolis, a tiny, mismatched cardboard rectangle sat stubbornly out of place, acting like a stain that was utterly impossible for him to ignore. Without even turning his head away from the magnificent view of the city skyline, the wealthy tycoon pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the offensive cardboard piece and demanded an explanation. His senior advisor cleared his throat nervously before explaining that it was the very last property on the block whose owner absolutely refused to sign the sale papers. They had already offered double and then triple the actual market value of the humble building. But the stubborn owner insisted that no amount of money could ever convince her to leave. Arthur allowed a cold, calculating smile to touch his lips, the kind of freezing expression that his corporate rivals often mistook for refined elegance and sophistication. He had spent his entire career listening to desperate people claim that their cherished properties had no price, yet every single one of them eventually caved when the right number of zeros was presented. He casually asked for the name of the troublesome establishment, and the advisor replied that it was known as Rose's Diner, a small neighborhood eatery that had been serving the local community for decades. The concept of a rundown neighborhood kitchen halting a multi-million-dollar corporate enterprise seemed almost laughable to a man who possessed limitless resources and unquestionable power. The advisor eagerly suggested that they simply force an immediate legal eviction, noting that the finalized documents were already prepared and merely required Arthur's personal signature to deploy the heavy demolition machinery. However, as the evening shadows began to fall over the bustling streets of Chicago, Arthur felt a strange, long-forgotten sensation creeping into his chest, an undeniable spark of genuine human curiosity. He wanted to look into the eyes of the foolish person who desperately clung to a handful of greasy tables and broken chairs when they could easily walk away with their pockets overflowing with cash. Before authorizing the destruction of the property, he firmly declared his intention to see the establishment with his own eyes, flatly rejecting the advisor's suggestion to schedule an official, heavily guarded corporate visit. He knew perfectly well that if he arrived wearing a tailored designer suit and flanked by aggressive lawyers, they would only show him the fabricated illusion they wanted him to see, not the hidden truth. That very evening, Arthur Bennett did something he had not done in over 30 years. He removed his luxury wristwatch that cost more than a sports car, draped it over his desk, and slipped into a faded jacket and an old baseball cap. For the first time in decades, he descended through the service elevator and stepped out onto the chilly pavement as an ordinary, nameless citizen, completely free of his usual security detail and suffocating corporate identity. He walked for several miles through the biting wind until he finally reached the condemned neighborhood, navigating through cracked sidewalks and flickering street lamps that he normally only observed from the tinted windows of his limousine. Tucked away at the end of a desolate corner, surrounded by closed metal shutters and fading "for sale" signs, he discovered a warm, inviting glow spilling out onto the cold concrete pavement like a comforting embrace. Above the wooden door, weathered letters painted entirely by hand proudly displayed the name Rose's Diner. And as he pushed the door open, a cheerful little brass bell rang brightly above his covered head. A sudden wave of comforting heat, carrying the rich, savory aroma of freshly baked bread and slow-cooked meat stew, immediately enveloped his freezing body and began to thaw his heavily guarded soul. The exposed brick walls of the cozy diner were completely covered with faded vintage photographs, colorful crayon drawings sketched by neighborhood children on paper napkins, and an old wall clock that ran perpetually late. In a quiet corner, resting on a wooden shelf, a small white candle burned steadily beside a beautifully framed portrait of a middle-aged woman boasting the warmest, most radiant smile Arthur had ever seen. Before he could fully process the unexpected wave of nostalgia, a young, exhausted waitress balancing a heavy tray of dishes rushed past him with a breathless smile, cheerfully telling him to grab any open seat he liked. Arthur chose a small, secluded table near the frosted front window, positioning himself in a dark corner where he could carefully observe the entire bustling dining room without drawing any unwanted attention to himself. He watched as the waitress, whom everyone affectionately called Catherine, seemed to effortlessly float between the crowded tables, intimately knowing the names and complex life stories of every single person seated in the room. She served a steaming bowl of soup to an elderly man, gently adjusted the chair for a pregnant woman, and playfully bounced a crying toddler on her hip, so the exhausted mother could finally eat a warm meal. A jovial neighborhood beat cop, Officer Davis, jokingly complained from his booth that Catherine had forgotten to bring him his usual slice of cherry pie, prompting her to wink and promise that the dessert was on the house tonight. The diner was filled with loud, overlapping conversations, genuine bursts of laughter, and a profound sense of community that Arthur spent vast fortunes attempting to artificially replicate in his luxury hotel lobbies, only to fail miserably every time. A few moments later, Catherine approached Arthur's isolated table and confidently placed a large, steaming bowl of rich beef stew and a piece of crusty bread directly in front of him, despite the fact that he had not ordered anything. When Arthur quietly pointed out that he had not requested the meal, Catherine simply smiled with a deeply knowing look and stated that he carried the unmistakable face of a man who had not tasted food cooked with genuine love in a very long time. She softly told him to eat in peace and assured him that nobody in this place would ever rush him, leaving the wealthy tycoon completely stunned by the profound kindness radiating from a total stranger. For several long minutes, Arthur merely stared down at the humble plate of food, reflecting on his usual miserable dinners at exclusive, wildly expensive restaurants where waiters recited exotic ingredients like rehearsed prayers. Slowly lifting the metal spoon, he took a small, hesitant bite of the savory stew, and the instant the rich flavors hit his tongue, his eyes snapped tightly shut, as an overwhelming wave of suppressed memory crashed into him. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the mighty billionaire was instantly transported back to his youth, reverting to the terrified, starving, homeless boy he used to be, who had once been shown unconditional mercy by a kind stranger. The visceral reaction made his hands tremble uncontrollably, forcing him to quickly open his eyes and forcefully swallow the heavy lump of emotion that had suddenly materialized in his tightly constricted throat. As the dark evening slowly progressed toward midnight, the crowded tables gradually emptied out, and the final lingering customers affectionately hugged Catherine goodbye, instead of offering the stiff, formal handshakes Arthur was accustomed to receiving. Eventually, the bright front sign was switched off. The little brass bell fell silent, and Arthur remained silently hidden in his dark corner, pretending to scroll through his mobile phone while the staff began their closing duties. It was then that a sharp, heartbreaking sound shattered the peaceful silence of the empty diner. It was the unmistakable, muffled sound of a woman desperately trying to choke back her violent, agonizing sobs. Arthur froze completely in his chair, straining his ears, as the elderly cook Harold emerged from the swinging kitchen doors, wiping his flour-covered hands on a towel, rushing to comfort the weeping young woman hidden behind the counter. Harold gently patted her trembling shoulder and promised that they would invent a clever solution to save the beloved business. But Catherine handed him a crumpled legal document and sobbed that this time no miracle could possibly save them. She confessed with absolute devastation that their trusted lawyer had officially resigned, claiming that it was entirely impossible to fight against the limitless resources and ruthless power of the massive corporate giant known as Vertex Group. Hearing the name of his own powerful holding company spoken with such pure, unadulterated terror caused all the oxygen to instantly vanish from Arthur's lungs, pinning him to his wooden chair in an invisible state of shock. Catherine wept bitterly as she confessed to Harold that she had fundamentally failed her deceased mother Rose, breaking the sacred, tearful promise she had made on her deathbed to keep the doors of this sanctuary permanently open. Her voice shattered completely as she asked the old cook how she was supposed to look her little brother in the eyes and explain that they were losing their home, their livelihood, and the last remaining piece of their beloved mother. Hearing the agonizing despair of a woman being crushed by a document that only required his final stroke of a pen, Arthur felt a sharp physical pain deeply piercing his heavily guarded heart. He quietly stood up from his hidden corner, silently placed a stack of $100 bills on the table that vastly exceeded the cost of the meal, and practically fled toward the glass door like a guilty thief in the night. Just as he stepped out into the freezing Chicago wind, he heard Catherine direct a desperate whispered prayer toward the flickering candle beside the portrait, begging her mother's spirit to hold on just a little bit longer. For the next 3 consecutive nights, Arthur Bennett found it utterly impossible to secure even a single hour of peaceful sleep within the cavernous, silent walls of his luxurious penthouse overlooking the glittering city of Chicago. The desperate, weeping voice of the young waitress continuously echoed in his mind like a relentless, dripping faucet, completely destroying his ability to concentrate on the massive corporate mergers and highly lucrative acquisitions demanding his daily attention. Furthermore, the incredibly distinct, comforting taste of that humble neighborhood stew stubbornly refused to leave his memory, teasing him with the terrifying certainty that he had intimately known that exact flavor in a previous, deeply buried lifetime. Unable to endure the psychological torture any longer, Arthur abruptly abandoned a critical board meeting, grabbed his faded jacket and worn baseball cap, and marched urgently back through the unforgiving city streets toward the condemned neighborhood. He desperately tried to rationalize the impulsive journey by convincing himself that he was merely conducting a thorough technical inspection of the final property standing in the way of his magnificent Horizon project. However, deep down in the most honest corner of his soul, he knew perfectly well that he was returning to Rose's diner entirely because he needed to chase down the ghosts that were violently rattling the cages of his mind. The familiar brass bell jingled cheerfully as he pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping into a quiet, late-afternoon atmosphere where the golden sunlight slanted beautifully through the frosted windows, bathing the worn furniture in a peaceful glow. Harold, the elderly cook, immediately recognized the solitary figure entering the room and greeted him with a warm, gravelly chuckle, loudly declaring that he thought the quiet stranger had completely disappeared from their struggling little world forever. Arthur awkwardly cleared his throat, searching for a plausible excuse, and quietly admitted that he simply could not stop thinking about the incredible stew, and had walked all the way across town just to experience it one more time. Harold beamed with genuine pride, grabbed a clean cloth to wipe down the counter, and personally brought out a fresh, steaming bowl of the legendary recipe, encouraging Arthur to sit comfortably in his usual secluded spot by the window. Taking the first deliberate spoonful, Arthur closed his eyes tightly, and immediately the chaotic noise of the modern city vanished, forcefully replaced by a vivid, unstoppable rush of a memory he had spent 4 decades trying to permanently erase. He saw himself as a filthy, emaciated teenager, shivering uncontrollably from the freezing winter rain, walking into a brightly lit diner with the desperate, terrifying intention of stealing food to survive another agonizing night on the cruel streets. In the vivid memory, instead of shouting for the police, a beautiful woman wearing a spotless white apron gently placed a comforting hand on his soaked shoulder, guided him to a warm table, and served him a massive plate of food. She had looked into his terrified, distrustful eyes with an expression of boundless maternal compassion and softly told him to eat in peace, assuring him that nobody in her establishment would ever rush him back out into the cold. Arthur's eyes snapped open in the present day, his breath catching sharply in his throat, as he finally realized that Catherine's welcoming words from his first visit were an exact word-for-word repetition of her late mother's sacred philosophy. Noticing the wealthy tycoon's sudden extreme pallor and visibly trembling hands, Harold pulled up a chair across from him, assuming the stranger was simply overwhelmed by the emotional weight of a truly exceptional home-cooked meal. Arthur managed to steady his voice enough to ask the old man about the brilliant creator of the recipe, and Harold proudly gestured toward the candlelit portrait of Rose, explaining that her spirit permanently resided within the very walls of the kitchen. The elderly cook shared that Rose never cooked to amass financial wealth, but rather utilized her culinary skills as a divine tool to spiritually and physically rescue the broken, desperate souls who frequently wandered into her humble establishment. Harold passionately explained that Rose firmly believed that merely handing a starving person a single plate of food only delayed their suffering until the next sunrise, which was why she dedicated her life to teaching lost children how to cook for themselves. Just as the old man finished his sentence, Catherine emerged from the bustling back room, carrying a massive stack of clean ceramic plates, her beautiful face visibly marked by deep, dark circles of exhaustion from carrying the weight of the world. Despite her obvious fatigue, she flashed Arthur a genuinely brilliant smile, playfully teasing him that the magical stew always managed to hook the lonely souls and force them to keep coming back for more comfort. Following closely behind Catherine was a small pale boy named Thomas, whose frail chest heaved slightly as he carefully carried a single brightly colored crayon drawing to show the kind regular customer sitting in the corner. Arthur stared at the sweet, innocent face of the little boy, realizing with a sickening jolt of absolute horror that this fragile child was another innocent life destined to be completely crushed beneath the relentless metallic treads of his incoming bulldozers. The heavy burden of his hidden identity felt like a massive concrete block resting directly on his chest, making it nearly impossible for him to draw a full breath as the smiling children of his savior warmly welcomed their executioner. The next morning, Arthur sat perfectly still behind the massive mahogany desk in his executive office, completely ignoring the frantic ringing of his telephones while staring blindly at a confidential financial report he had secretly ordered regarding the diner's specific debts. The heavily encrypted file revealed a terrifying, tragic truth that made his stomach violently churn. The massive, insurmountable loan crushing Catherine and Thomas was owned by a shadow financial institution operating under the deceptive name of Hawk Credit. Arthur felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead when he saw the legal documentation proving that Hawk Credit was actually a deeply buried, wholly owned subsidiary of his very own corporate empire, Vertex Group. The horrifying realization meant that his massive company was not only preparing to physically demolish the family's beloved restaurant, but his financial division had already ruthlessly stolen their private residential home through a highly aggressive foreclosure process months earlier. He was the invisible monster crushing a desperate, grieving young woman between the steel jaws of two distinct corporate entities, effectively destroying the remaining children of the only human being who had ever shown him unconditional love and mercy. Driven by a sudden desperate need to stop the bleeding, Arthur furiously marched down the glass hallway and burst into the immaculate office of his ruthless junior partner and Chief Financial Officer Ethan Norris, demanding an immediate halt to the eviction. Ethan casually looked up from his meticulously organized spreadsheets, took a slow, deliberate sip of his expensive imported coffee, and coldly reminded Arthur that the neighborhood property was the absolutely critical final puzzle piece required for the entire Horizon project. The younger partner smiled with a chilling lack of empathy, echoing the exact same ruthless corporate mantras that Arthur himself had aggressively taught him over the past 15 years of their highly profitable, entirely emotionless business relationship. Ethan firmly stated that showing even a single ounce of mercy to a sobbing waitress would immediately project weakness to their aggressive international investors. resulting in the catastrophic loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in highly leveraged construction capital. Defeated by his own monstrous creation, Arthur retreated to his office and made a highly secretive encrypted phone call to his most trusted private banker, ordering the immediate anonymous cancellation of the crippling financial debt held by Hawk Credit. He explicitly commanded that the outstanding balance be entirely erased and that a formal letter of cancellation be swiftly dispatched to the diner without a single trace of his name or his corporation's involvement attached to the sudden miracle. He foolishly believed that this cowardly, invisible act of financial charity would somehow magically cleanse his stained conscience, completely failing to understand that hiding behind the immense power of his wealth was merely another pathetic form of moral cowardice. Meanwhile, back in the warm, bustling environment of Rose's diner, the oppressive atmosphere was heavy with the tragic, undeniable reality of the rapidly approaching deadline forcing the small staff to begin the heartbreaking process of packing away their lives. Margaret, a deeply loyal customer who lived down the street, gently helped Catherine wrap the fragile glass salt shakers in old newspapers, silently weeping as they carefully dismantled the beautiful community sanctuary piece by painful piece. Harold descended from the dusty attic, carrying a heavy sealed wooden box, tightly wrapped in frayed twine, reverently presenting it to Catherine, and explaining that it contained her mother's most treasured, intensely private personal belongings that had never been touched. With visibly shaking hands, Catherine slowly untied the ancient knot and opened the creaking lid, discovering a beautiful treasure trove of handwritten recipe cards, faded vintage photographs, and a thick leather-bound journal filled with her mother's elegant, sweeping handwriting. Sitting at the front counter with Arthur quietly watching from his usual corner booth, Catherine began to read the final tear-stained page of the journal aloud, her voice trembling violently as the profound emotional weight of the words filled the silent room. Rose had written a deeply moving, passionate letter to God, expressing her endless hope for the homeless, terrified boy to whom she had given every single penny of her life savings so he could start a small food cart. Catherine's voice broke into a raw whisper as she read her mother's final desperate plea, begging the universe to protect the young man who never returned, revealing to the stunned room that the boy's given name was Arthur. Hearing his own name spoken in the context of such pure, unbroken maternal love felt like a physical bullet violently tearing through Arthur's chest, leaving him completely paralyzed and struggling to breathe in the suffocating silence of the diner. Little Thomas immediately dropped his brightly colored crayons, his huge eyes lighting up with absolute wonder as he excitedly shouted that the magical man from his mother's bedtime stories was named Arthur, proving that the beautiful legend was entirely real. At that exact terrifying moment, a uniformed postal worker pushed through the heavy wooden door and handed Catherine an official crisp white envelope containing the anonymous legal notice declaring that their massive financial debt had been permanently erased. Instead of weeping with joy, Catherine's exhausted face twisted into an expression of profound suspicion and deep fear, recognizing the ruthless, manipulative tactics often employed by massive corporate predators attempting to forcefully pacify their struggling victims before a hostile takeover. Arthur watched in silent agony as his desperate, cowardly attempt at invisible salvation was immediately interpreted as a sinister, poisonous trap, finally making him realize that true redemption absolutely required the immense courage of looking his victims in the eye. That night, sitting alone in his dark, cavernous penthouse, Arthur clutched a fragile, stained paper napkin bearing the original stew recipe he had copied by hand over 40 years ago, completely consumed by an ocean of agonizing regret. The wise, gravelly voice of Harold the cook constantly echoed in his tortured mind, loudly declaring that honest men never hide in the shadows, but bravely show their faces and accept the painful consequences of their destructive actions. When the golden sun finally broke over the vast skyline of Chicago, Arthur made the absolute most terrifying yet undeniably righteous decision of his entire adult life. He was going to walk into the light and finally tell the truth. He arrived at the diner wearing a tailored, expensive suit instead of his usual faded disguise, stepping through the front door just as Catherine was placing her mother's faded photograph into a cardboard box with gentle, deeply reverent hands. She looked up initially confused by his formal, wealthy appearance, but as she stared deeply into his unprotected, sorrowful eyes, a shocking wave of recognition slowly washed over her exhausted features, connecting the wealthy stranger to the boy in the photograph. Arthur slowly raised his trembling hands in a gesture of complete surrender, and spoke with a voice completely broken by decades of accumulated grief, loudly confessing that he was the homeless boy her mother had saved from the freezing rain. Catherine dropped the empty cardboard box, her hands violently flying to cover her mouth, as hot, heavy tears of absolute shock and overwhelming joy began to pour relentlessly down her pale cheeks, fully believing that a divine miracle had occurred. She frantically called out to Harold and Thomas, joyously shouting that her mother had been right all along, that the magical man from the beautiful stories had finally returned to save them from the evil, faceless corporation destroying their lives. Little Thomas ran out from the kitchen and threw his tiny, fragile arms tightly around Arthur's expensive, tailored legs, burying his face in the fine fabric and crying out that he had waited every single day for his hero to arrive. The immense, crushing weight of the little boy's pure, unquestioning love felt like 1,000 burning daggers violently piercing Arthur's soul, forcing him to close his eyes and gather every ounce of courage he possessed to completely shatter their beautiful illusion. With tears streaming freely down his own weathered face, Arthur gently pushed the little boy back, looked directly into Catherine's hopeful, shining eyes, and loudly confessed that he was the sole, absolute owner of the massive Vertex Group. He forced himself to clearly articulate the horrifying truth. The man who had mercilessly stolen their home, authorized the aggressive eviction, and planned to demolish their mother's sacred sanctuary was the exact same boy Rose had rescued from starvation. The deafening, horrifying silence that immediately followed his brutal confession was so thick and heavy that it felt as though the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room, leaving the small family completely paralyzed in a state of shock. Catherine physically recoiled from him as if he were covered in a deadly infectious disease. The beautiful, radiant light of hope instantly dying in her eyes, rapidly replaced by a terrifying mixture of absolute revulsion and bottomless, soul-crushing betrayal. She screamed at him with a raw, guttural voice fueled by pure agony, demanding to know how he could possibly sit at her table, eat her mother's food, and allow her little brother to hug him while actively planning their total destruction. Arthur dropped heavily to his knees, right there on the worn linoleum floor, openly weeping and begging for a chance to use his massive wealth to fix the catastrophic damage he had caused, swearing to protect them forever. But Catherine fiercely pulled her terrified brother behind her protective body, pointing a violently trembling finger toward the heavy wooden door, and viciously commanded the wealthy billionaire to leave her family alone and never ever show his face there again. She stated with absolute chilling conviction that she would vastly prefer to be homeless and lose absolutely everything in the world than accept a single penny from the vile monster who had so ruthlessly broken her dead mother's enormous heart. Utterly destroyed by the righteous fury of the woman he had severely wronged, Arthur slowly climbed to his feet, casting one final agonizing glance at the glowing candle, illuminating the smiling portrait of Rose resting upon the dusty wooden shelf. He walked out into the freezing Chicago morning, completely shattered, carrying the devastating realization that some deeply inflicted wounds cannot simply be bandaged with a thick stack of $100 bills, or fixed by a sudden, dramatic change of heart. However, as the bitter wind whipped fiercely against his tear-stained face, a new incredibly powerful sense of absolute clarity washed over his broken spirit. A truly repentant man does not simply surrender and walk away when he is rightfully rejected. Arthur immediately marched straight into the towering glass headquarters of Vertex Group, completely ignoring his frantic, panicked assistants, and forcefully kicked open the heavy oak doors leading directly into the opulent, sunlit office of his junior partner, Ethan Norris. Without a single moment of hesitation or a trace of doubt in his voice, Arthur slammed his hands on the desk and issued a completely irreversible, legally binding executive order to permanently cancel the entire Horizon project, effective immediately. Ethan stared at him in absolute horror, screaming that triggering the massive penalty clauses to the aggressive international investors would instantly liquidate Arthur's entire personal fortune and completely strip him of the magnificent empire he had spent 40 years building. Arthur simply smiled at his enraged partner with a profound, unprecedented sense of spiritual freedom, softly declaring that losing his massive cold empire was a ridiculously small price to pay to finally reclaim the human soul he had abandoned. He officially signed the catastrophic liquidation papers without a single tremor in his hand, actively watching decades of relentless corporate ambition, billions of dollars, and unparalleled social power instantly evaporate into thin air with the swift stroke of a pen. Despite his rapid, decisive corporate actions, he terrifyingly realized that the massive bureaucratic machinery governing the demolition crews had already been set into motion, and stopping the heavy equipment required more than just signing a piece of paper. The dreadful morning of the scheduled eviction arrived with the violent, terrifying roar of massive yellow bulldozers and heavy excavators aggressively positioning themselves at the very edge of the condemned neighborhood, violently spewing thick, choking clouds of dark diesel exhaust. Catherine stood bravely on the cracked concrete sidewalk directly in front of the diner's wooden door, fiercely holding Thomas tightly by the hand, absolutely determined to physically block the heavy machinery from touching the sacred walls of her mother's legacy. A rude, impatient construction foreman aggressively shoved a final legal warning into her hands, yelling over the deafening roar of the idling engines that she needed to clear the area immediately or face forceful physical removal by the approaching riot police. The incredibly stressful environment, combined with the massive swirling clouds of thick dust forcefully kicked up by the heavy construction vehicles, triggered a sudden catastrophically violent asthma attack deep within the fragile, terrified chest of little Thomas. The pale boy suddenly collapsed onto the hard concrete sidewalk, clutching his throat with tiny, frantic hands, his lips rapidly turning a terrifying shade of blue as he desperately fought a losing battle to draw oxygen into his rapidly constricting lungs. Catherine dropped to her knees, screaming with absolute, unadulterated terror, begging the surrounding construction workers and paralyzed neighbors for urgent medical assistance, while frantically trying to guide her brother through the breathing exercises that were no longer working. Suddenly, a sleek, incredibly expensive black luxury sedan aggressively jumped the curb, its tires screaming violently against the concrete before slamming to a complete halt mere inches from the terrifying chaos surrounding the dying child and his screaming sister. Arthur Bennett threw open the driver's door and sprinted toward the collapsed boy, his designer suit completely forgotten, as he forcefully pushed his way through the stunned crowd and scooped the limp, heavy body of little Thomas into his strong arms. Ignoring Catherine's initial defensive protests, he roared with the absolute authority of a desperate father, commanding her to get into the vehicle immediately, because waiting for an ambulance to navigate the blocked streets would absolutely cost the child his life. The frantic, terrifying race through the crowded, chaotic streets of downtown Chicago was a blur of blaring horns, desperately swerved corners, and Arthur continuously shouting words of fierce encouragement to the fading boy through the rearview mirror. Catherine sat completely paralyzed in the back seat, holding her brother's limp head in her lap, while openly sobbing and praying to her mother's spirit, suddenly realizing that the hand steering them toward salvation belonged to the man she despised. Arthur violently skidded the vehicle to a halt, perfectly in front of the emergency room doors at Chicago General Hospital, carrying the boy inside while screaming for medical assistance with a raw, terrifying intensity that commanded immediate absolute obedience from the staff. For 3 agonizing, excruciatingly long hours, Arthur and Catherine sat silently on opposite sides of the sterile, freezing hospital waiting room, completely united by a shared, overwhelming terror that transcended their massive, incredibly complicated history of pain and betrayal. Finally, a thoroughly exhausted but gently smiling physician, Dr. Evans, emerged through the heavy swinging doors and delivered the miraculous, beautiful news that they had arrived just in time. The boy had been successfully stabilized and would make a complete recovery. Catherine completely collapsed into the uncomfortable plastic waiting room chair, weeping uncontrollably from the overwhelming wave of pure relief, and for the very first time, she did not violently pull away when Arthur gently placed a comforting hand upon her trembling shoulder. Allowed to briefly visit the recovery room, they found Thomas looking incredibly pale, but breathing comfortably, securely connected to a quiet machine, delivering a steady rhythmic flow of pure, clean oxygen directly into his exhausted, tiny lungs. The boy slowly opened his heavy eyelids, his gaze weakly traveling past his weeping sister to land directly on the tall, imposing figure of the former billionaire, standing quietly and respectfully at the absolute edge of the sterile medical room. Thomas offered a tiny, incredibly brave smile and whispered softly that he always knew the magical man would come back to save him, completely shattering the very last remaining piece of hardened ice guarding Arthur Bennett's thoroughly transformed heart. True redemption, however, is never merely a single dramatic rescue. It is the quiet, deeply humble dedication of a lifetime spent actively repairing the fragile, broken foundations of the beautiful lives we once carelessly destroyed in our blind pursuit of power. Having permanently lost his massive corporate fortune, Arthur returned to the diner the very next week, wearing a cheap pair of canvas overalls, carrying a heavy toolbox, and silently began repairing the extensive physical damage caused by the halted demolition. Slowly, over many months of silent, incredibly hard physical labor and unspoken apologies, Catherine and Harold finally allowed the profoundly humbled man to rejoin their fragile family, firmly uniting their shared painful past into a deeply beautiful, highly purposeful future. Exactly 1 year after the terrifying events that nearly destroyed their world, the beautifully restored wooden doors of Rose's Diner were joyously thrown open to the bustling Chicago neighborhood, but the beloved establishment had evolved into something incredibly magnificent. It was no longer simply a neighborhood restaurant. One half of the large room served paying customers, while the extensively expanded kitchen served as a completely free, highly structured culinary training academy designed specifically for the lost homeless youth of the massive city. Arthur, permanently trading his expensive designer suits for a simple, spotless white cooking apron, spent his long, deeply fulfilling days patiently teaching terrified, hungry teenagers how to properly chop fresh vegetables, balance delicate spices, and slowly rebuild their shattered self-esteem. One freezing, rainy evening in late November, the cheerful little brass bell rang sharply, and a completely soaked, deeply terrified teenager cautiously stepped into the warm light, looking exactly like a wild, cornered animal, fully expecting to be violently chased away. The boy stood shivering violently near the entrance, weakly whispering that he did not possess a single penny to pay for a warm meal. his eyes frantically darting toward the heavy wooden door, completely prepared to run back into the frozen darkness. Catherine, proudly wiping down the front counter, simply smiled, with boundless radiant warmth, gently caught Arthur's eye across the bustling room, and knowingly nodded her head toward the terrified, shivering young man standing desperately in the doorway. Arthur immediately set down his heavy metal mixing bowl, wiped his flour-covered hands on his white apron, and walked slowly toward the frightened teenager with a deeply peaceful, incredibly gentle smile that perfectly mirrored the expression Rose had once shown him. He placed a warm, incredibly comforting hand on the boy's soaked shoulder, gently guiding him toward the absolute best table, positioned right next to the massive, roaring brick fireplace, and personally served him a massive, steaming bowl of the legendary beef stew. Looking deeply into the terrified eyes of the homeless youth, Arthur softly repeated the beautiful sacred words that had completely altered the tragic trajectory of his own life so many decades ago. "Eat in peace, my son. Absolutely nobody here will ever rush you." The young boy is overwhelmed by the unconditional kindness shown to him, while Rose's portrait stands as a symbol of the promise she made years before, a promise fulfilled through Arthur Bennett's transformation. Once a ruthless billionaire, Arthur discovers that his true legacy lies not in wealth, but in serving others, teaching children, and keeping Rose's spirit alive through compassion. Around him, Harold Catherine Thomas and the entire Diner family find peace, joy, and healing as the humble restaurant becomes a place of hope, second chances, and genuine community. Rose's Diner proves that love and generosity can accomplish what money and power cannot. A simple meal shared with kindness has the power to restore dignity, heal broken lives, and unite people in lasting ways. The story reminds us that true success is measured not by fortune or status, but by humble service, accountability, and daily acts of compassion. By choosing kindness over pride and helping those in need, anyone can create a legacy that outlives material wealth and becomes a lasting light for others.